Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. We're a little less than 3 weeks away from the start of the regular season as we record this on Friday, October 22nd. This episode will actually come out early next week, but wanted to touch base with one of my favorite resources for college basketball, Big Ten basketball, Wisconsin basketball, Bart Torvik, author. I don't know if you want to call him author. I don't know that he writes a whole lot, but he does put together, in my opinion, one of the better formulas for rating teams in college basketball over at barttorvik.com. Bart, welcome back to the show. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So I first want to just kind of ask a pretty loaded question because I was as high on Wisconsin as anybody going into last season. I think I picked them to win the league, and after I saw them, I think the last game I actually saw in person, because I didn't go to games last season. Actually, the last game I did see in person was at Assembly Hall, Wisconsin, beating Indiana to get that share of the Big Ten title before everything shut down with COVID. And last season, what happened in your eyes with the Badgers? You follow them as closely as anybody. You're not shy about your Wisconsin fandom. So just curious from your perspective, what happened last season in Madison?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to say for sure. I mean, it seems in hindsight pretty clear they had some chemistry issues. And I think that was sort of evident from watching them. Things just didn't really mesh, which is weird because, like you were saying, they got to share the Big Ten title the year before, seemed pretty together during that run when they won the last how many games they won. But obviously winning cures a lot of ills and losing makes things harder. And so I kind of think it's a little bit of a combination of they got a little bit overrated from a somewhat lucky run to end the previous year. And then last year they weren't as bad as sometimes they looked, like obviously their KenPom and power numbers ended up being pretty good, or always good throughout the whole season. They just couldn't beat anybody better than them for most of the year. So it was frustrating, like they destroyed Loyola early in the year and they beat pretty much every team they were supposed to beat, and then lost every team that, you might have hoped they would beat who was better than them. And clearly it just kind of wore on them. And so it was just a frustrating season. Clearly they were all frustrated. I think they did have some sort of fundamental flaws, with Reavers and Potter not really being able to play with each other. They tried a few times, but really they just, at least Guard couldn't figure out a way to keep them both on the floor at the same time, defensively especially. And on that note, Reavers just had he had a really disappointing year. If you go back and look at those preseason things from last year, I think he was first team All Big Ten preseason, at least in some of the, media things. And clearly he was just kind of just a guy last year for the most part. And Potter, Potter's numbers were good. And so I feel like I have no inside knowledge about this, but I feel like that was sort of the core, thing that was rubbing the wrong way, is that who gets those minutes at the five, Reavers or Potter? How are they interacting? Maybe there were, are there factions on the team? I can say this, I played hockey growing up and I was a goalie, and I played on teams where where I was one of multiple goalies and only one goalie can play, and if they're similar skill wise, there's going to be factions on the team, and the coach can, rub people the wrong way by choosing the wrong one, according to some people. So that's kind of my feeling, is that was the core problem, is those two guys who in some ways were probably their most talented guys couldn't really jive. So we can have that problem.
Right. Yeah. One of the more interesting things that actually came out this summer in the Big Ten, just in general, wasn't really a basketball struggle with Wisconsin. It was this leaked tape that was, I don't know exactly how it got out, but it seems like one of the former assistant coach, maybe that's how it surfaced. But long story short, it was basically a tape for those who didn't hear it, with conversation with, I believe, some of last year's seniors and Greg Gard, and just kind of back and forth and talking about some things that maybe were handled not in the best way behind the scenes, and people and both sides kind of talking that through. And that kind of hints at what you mentioned, maybe with the chemistry issue. I guess, how was that news received by Wisconsin fans, and was there any angst with the fan base in terms of the future of Greg Gard and like how he's handling this program, or did it blow over pretty quickly and people got over it?
Overall, I think it blew over. From the message board stuff, my view of how the fans took it is they kind of circled the wagons around Gard for the most part, because I listened to it and there's nothing explosive in that tape. It's guys complaining that they don't like the way Greg Gard is being kind of mean to them at practice, and stuff like that. And I think I don't want to say that those complaints are totally illegitimate, in the sense that it seems like Gard probably has to take that to heart. And whether players are changing with their expectations or not, or whether these things always kind of happened, which is what some people think. He's in a tough spot because he's a longtime assistant for a unique person in Bo Ryan with a unique personality, and to some extent he in many ways has tried to emulate Bo and been pretty successful with it. But I think there's an issue of he's not Bo Ryan, personality wise at all. And I think you run into this a lot with acolytes trying to follow up on their mentors. Is, people can kind of sense a phoniness sometimes. And if he's trying to be someone he's not, it sometimes it doesn't work, right? And people kind of key in on that. So, and Gard is still only in his sixth or seventh year or whatever. So he's a young guy still. He's frankly not that much older than I am, which is kind of weird. But so he's got some improving and learning to do probably to handle those kinds of personnel issues, which are a lot of what coaching is.
I'm curious, just with, you mentioned, you're trying to follow Bo Ryan, and when he first got the job, I wasn't sure that he would actually last as long as he did, but really, or as he has. I mean, he's still obviously firmly entrenched there at this point as the coach. Have you been surprised at all at how successful he's been? Because a lot of times when somebody does take over for a coach that has, the pedigree, the success of somebody like Bo Ryan, it's, they go through the next guy and it's 3 or 4 years and they're out and then they move on to something different. Or Gard, I mean, he's not Bo Ryan, as you mentioned, but he has been pretty successful, relative to other Big Ten programs. I don't know where Wisconsin would rank in the league since he took over, but I would think they're at least 5th or 6th at worst in performance under him, and maybe a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they've got maybe the 4th or 5th most Big Ten wins under Gard since he took over.
Okay.
And obviously won a Big Ten title, and those things for sort of an somewhat older Wisconsin fan like me, that's a big deal. know, when Bo Ryan got a share of the title in 2002, that was first time in 47 years that Wisconsin had won the Big Ten. So those things are still huge deals, still, very impressive to do at Wisconsin. I think one hope might've been maybe he'll recruit better, like being on more top 50 guys or something. Not that you need that, obviously, but that hasn't really happened. It almost happened. They almost got Tyler Hero. But basically he's stuck with the formula, and the formula still, for the most part, seems to work the way I think there's something a little bit missing, some special thing that Bo Ryan had, but he's stuck to his guns. He's not, I think it's a credit to Gard that he's not like flailing around trying to make his own signature just for the sake of doing it. I think he's very analytical. He has learned what he thinks works, and he's going to keep doing it until it stops working, And so the next couple of years will be an interesting test for that because it's a little bit of a rebuilding year this year. Obviously, they've got a fairly new team. They don't have any, 5-star guy coming in where you're saying, oh, they're going to pick right up. I think Wisconsin fans are hoping this year they're kind of on the bubble, hopefully maybe make the tournament. But if they don't, I don't think anybody's going to be calling for his head. But then next year, assuming everybody comes back, then you would say if this is the same sort of program, then next year they should be a contender or, up in the top half of the Big Ten at least.
Yeah, your preseason ranking on them is, I think, pretty similar to Ken Palm. You got them 54, and I, reached out to you it was probably a month ago now, a little maybe over a month, when Dylan Burkhart and I of Hoops were going through our annual preseason list of the top 25 Big Ten players, going into the season. And one of the guys that I asked you about that I'm most intrigued by, obviously, Jonathan Davis, who was, I thought, pretty good last season as a freshman, but this year is going to be a lot more on him just based on everything that Wisconsin left. Beyond, in your eyes, is Davis the most important player for Wisconsin this season? And beyond him and Brad Davison, who are some of the other guys that are really going to have to step into key roles if Wisconsin is going to kind of reach its potential and potentially get back to the tournament?
Yeah, I think Davis is definitely the key. He's the guy I think he was a top 150 recruit, but seems like he was a little bit underrated in that sense. And he's definitely an intriguing player for Wisconsin, in that he's a little bit more of a, slasher, athletic offensive player who still takes pride in his defense. So he's got a lot of potential, and you would hope that he's ready to take a leap, and kind of the classic sophomore leap for a guy that got a fair amount of playing time as a freshman, which is not necessarily normal at Wisconsin. So if he doesn't take a leap, then it's hard to see Wisconsin really being good this year. And the sort of exciting thing was over the summer, he tried out for the U19 team that played in like the World U19 Championships or whatever that the U.S. won. He was a reserve on that team, but the fact that he made it was a pretty big surprise. That was not something people were expecting, because it's an indication that he's probably one of the top 30 U.S. players, at least top 50 U.S. players in his age bracket, right? And he brings something that the coaching staff on that team saw in the tryouts. And what I see in watching him play, besides just the athletic gifts, is he's got a mean streak. He plays with an edge that I really like, and that's really noticeable. And the way he was able to fit in on that team with all those seniors last year was impressive. And I think he was sort of biding his time, and I think it's his team now, pretty much. Obviously, Davison is also going to be another leader, but kind of a different kind of leader, more vocal, whereas Davis, I think, is more of a lead by example and that kind of leader. So you're right, he's the key, but it's not necessarily going to be enough, even if he does take a leap, and it is pretty good, because they lost a lot. They lost all those seniors except for Davison, and the glaring hole is at point guard. They lost Trice, who was there for 5 years, and there's nobody, and they lost Trevor Anderson, who was his backup. Not a huge deal, obviously, but it'd be nice to have somebody with some college experience. So they've got a freshman coming in named Chucky Hepburn out of Nebraska. I think he was Nebraska State Player of the Year. And the reports I've seen are that if he's healthy, he's going to start in all likelihood at point guard. And so that's a huge unknown, right? To have a freshman point guard starting in the Big Ten for Wisconsin. I think you got to go back to Devin Harris. I mean, they've done it a couple of times. Davison kind of had to do it during that injury-ravaged year a few years ago. But so he's a huge key. If he's ready to play, then I think Wisconsin can be a legit bubble team. If he's your more typical top 150 recruit, struggles as a freshman, then it could be tough. Like I know Indiana saw this with Christian
Lander.
His last name right now, Lander.
Yeah.
I was going to say Leitner, but Lander last year, he was an early enrollee, right? So he was really young too, kind of a super freshman. but he wasn't really ready to play, even though he's got tons of talent, right?
Right.
Or at least play at a Big Ten level. So that's a huge question mark hanging out. They do have another point guard, freshman point guard named Lauren Bowman out of Michigan, who was kind of their biggest recruit last year, but ended up kicking the year off for undisclosed family reasons. And he didn't really play basketball for a year. So we'll see if he's ready to get up to speed or not. But so it's another roll of the dice if he's turns out to be good. And I think people are excited in the long run about him. But for this year, it's hopefully Chucky.
Yeah. One last thing on Wisconsin, then I obviously want to ask you about some Indiana stuff and just the Big Ten at large, because I think there's some interesting things just based on how you have these teams ranked in the preseason. But Wisconsin, in terms of how they fit in the Big Ten this season, I've seen them picked. I participated in the preseason, I guess unofficial, unofficial Big Ten media poll. I think I had them ninth, maybe. Just behind Indiana, and they've been picked, I think, most places somewhere in that range, 9, 10. I mean, is that in your mind pretty fair given all the unknowns going into the season and some of the teams around them?
Yeah, I think it's fair. Obviously, as a Wisconsin fan, you bristle a little bit because there's been a lot of times over the years that Wisconsin has been picked to fall back, and most of the time they haven't. But
right.
There's a good reason to believe that's the case this year, or at least to have the uncertainty, like you say. There's a lot of, I think the top half of the league, the top 7 teams is pretty clear. Teams with known quantities coming back. Most of those teams have like a potential All-American center, when you're talking about top 25 players or whatever. I don't think I've seen any list of top 20 players in the Big Ten that has a single Wisconsin player on it, or top 100 players nationally. Mm-hmm. You won't see any Wisconsin players, so it's going to have to be whole is greater than the sum of its parts kind of year for them to move up the table. But I think that you'd be reluctant to say they're going to finish at the bottom of the league based on their history of that's the kind of program they have, right? So it seems like they have a relatively high floor, but it's reasonable to think that its ceiling is not real high either.
Right. And I may have asked you this back in 2017 when Archie Miller took over for Tom Crean, but when you're making a projection, your formula, can you walk me through how it accounts for a coaching change and a guy like Mike Woodson, who obviously has spent his whole career coaching in the NBA? There's not a body of work that you can go to and say, this is how his team is going to play. This is what the offense is going to look like. This is what the defense is going to look like. This is something I, talked about to John Gassaway a couple of weeks ago on the show. And he basically said it's a clean slate in terms of how you look at Indiana, because we don't know until we get those early November and December games. But I'm just curious, when you're thinking about this and how to account for that and how your formula works, how does it view a coaching change going from Archie Miller to Mike Woodson?
So, like most of my preseason stuff, it's pretty blunt, speculative. For coaching changes in particular, there's kind of a general assumption that it's going to, take that program a little bit to the mean. So for Indiana or most Big Ten teams, that would be a slight depression of the projection as a baseline, because usually you don't lose a coach for good reasons. Even if it's that the coach is really good, losing him is usually not good. So that's the baseline. It's not a huge factor, just because, there's so much variability that I can't really detect a whole lot of signal in coaching changes, and they happen for all kinds of reasons. And then, every coach kind of has their own rating, if they have a history, and that's derived based on like their results compared to their programs they've been at, how they've performed under other coaches. So you kind of get a plus minus there. Obviously Woodson, there's none of that. So basically Indiana's, the coaching effect for their preseason rating is a little bit of a slight downward projection.
So one interesting thing to me, and maybe you can shed some light on why this might be. So Indiana in Ken Palm is 31. Last season they finished, I think it was 50 in Ken Palm. So what is that? Is that mainly Trace Jackson Davis coming back to school and some other key returnees, or because, like you said, you don't usually lose a coach for a good reason. But it's interesting to me that Indiana's going from, 50 last year to end Ken Palm. And I know a lot of his takes into consideration his early rankings, at least, and I'm sure yours do too, a heavy emphasis on what happened last season, right? So for them to jump up to that amount, is that mainly powered by Trace coming back to school?
Yeah, obviously I don't know exactly what Ken Palm is doing, but I think, it's basically you get a kind of a program rating based on recent performance, usually the last 3 years or so, with more emphasis on the last year. I know Ken Palm also takes into consideration stuff like resources that the program has. So like just in general, if you think about Indiana with the resources it has and the kind of program it is, you would expect them to be pretty good in general, right? And to kind of move up. But they haven't been good for quite a while now. So if like maybe the last 5 years, they're probably like 40th or 50th on average in Ken Palm, something like that. So it is a little bit, I can see where you'd be a little bit surprised that they'd get this bump up and to be 31st or third. And then it's the same in my system. I think they're 30th. But, it is Trace Jackson Davis in my system. I can say my system has some of those attributes, but it's at least on offense really built from the players up. So it makes projections for the players that are based on their historical performance, and then also things like their recruiting pedigree, and builds that up into a projection for the offense. And a guy like Trace Jackson Davis, he's a great player, and a great player with a great recruiting pedigree coming back for his junior year. He's going to get a great projection in my system. So that's kind of where it comes from. And then they've got other solid players coming back around him too. So they ended up, at the end of the day, they returned a solid nucleus of players. And if Archie was coming back, they would be expected with these same guys. I think you would expect this team to improve, right, over last year. So that's basically it. It's the nucleus around what on paper at least, and in reality too, I think is a really great player in Trace Jackson Davis.
One question that I've had people ask me, and I've told them I'll go straight to you and ask you this, and you should hopefully be able to explain when you're looking, like I'm looking at your top 10 projected contributors for Indiana. And I know obviously this is all automated to a degree because you've got 350 teams that you're doing. But when, like, for example, like a guy like Miller Kopp, you've got him projected to play 37% of minutes, 4.2 points per game. I would think Indiana fans see him playing a bigger role. How specifically do you kind of try to put together those projections and figuring out which guy's going to play most, and how much can that impact these rankings if, say, Tamar Bates or a Miller Kopp plays more, has a bigger role than kind of what you expect going in?
So yeah, it's really tough. Obviously, the minutes projection is, especially if you're talking about guys outside like the top 3 projected minutes guys, it gets really a little bit erratic. But basically, every player has kind of their own projection, right, for how many minutes they would get on kind of an average team, and then you put them together on a team, and then there's an algorithm that tries to sort out, okay, given these 10 guys, who's going to get the minutes. And basically the minutes are, not everybody can play 80% of minutes, right? So you put them in order, and then there's kind of a sorting mechanism. So basically it's saying Miller Kopp is like the 7th guy on this team based on the projection that he has. And it's always difficult with transfers. Transferring is just another fly in the ointment, kind of like, how is a guy going to fit in? Typically guys get used a little less when they transfer to a Big Ten team. Obviously there's a huge variety of outcomes in that, but that's just kind of the basic the general rule. So then he just kind of gets sorted in the 7th guy, and then the minutes kind of reflect that. So if he was sorted in the 6th guy, he'd probably have the Tamar Bates
numbers
projection. Right? Yeah. So how much does it affect the projection? It can affect it a lot, depending on, what the underlying projection for his usage and offensive rating is. In the case of Indiana, if you look at the list of projected contributors, basically from 3 through 8, they're very similar. So it really wouldn't affect their projection hardly at all. Like if I can do this, and sometimes I do boost a guy's minutes if it's like clearly wrong or I just don't like it. Then it's just not fine tuned enough. It's not like my projection goes in and says, oh, this is going to be a bad 3-point shooting team because these top 6 guys, none of them are 3-point shooters. So they suffer for that. It's not that detailed. It's just basically all based on, for at least for the offense, it's based on their offensive rating and usage, which is nearly identical for the 2 guys, 3 guys ahead of them. So those concerns are, those are valid objections, but I'm more concerned ultimately about the team projection. So unless I think it's really screwing up the team projection, I just leave it alone.
Gotcha. That makes sense. One other thing, just kind of on projections, just because I'm curious about this, when you're talking about a freshman, and this kind of goes back to what you mentioned earlier with Lander, where Dylan and I last season put him in our preseason top 25 Big Ten players list. He was 24th, and he was not even one of the top 10 players on Indiana's team last season. And that with freshmen in general, I guess we don't have to worry about this as much in the Big Ten because the Big Ten's recruiting isn't on par with the ACC or the SEC or the Big 12 in terms of highly ranked kids. But a guy like Tamar Bates is, a top 25 kid, and Michigan this year maybe has some freshmen that are more highly ranked than what we're used to seeing coming into the Big Ten. But just in general, how do you project? Are you looking at like their composite ranking on 24/7, or are you looking at their RSCI ranking? I know that's like a composite that you can look at, but just in general, how do you project freshmen coming in?
Yeah, I basically use with some tweaks, the 24/7 composite, and then the projections are just based on that rank, and then their height. And then, of course, how they fit in on a team. So, if Tamar Bates was on Texas Southern or something like that, he'd probably be the number 1 guy or something.
Right.
And it's very highly weighted towards very top guys. So like top 5, the number 1 recruit is going to, and, this year, I think that's Chet Holmgren it gets basically an All-American projection. But then once you get down to someone like Tamar Bates, it's like, 6th man on Indiana projection.
Right.
So it's very heavily weighted towards the top guys. And then there's an adjustment made for the team's history of how freshmen perform and also the coach's history. Actually either or, depending on the circumstances. So there are some programs that have a history, especially for guys who aren't in that top category. So like basically less than non-top 100 recruits. It's very much based on how non-top 100 recruits have performed for that school or that coach in the past.
So I want to get to the Big Ten at large here with, about the last 10 minutes or so we have with you, but you've got 3 teams, I think, grouped pretty highly at the top or close together. Well, actually, I guess 4 if you want to count Ohio State. You got 4, I think, in the top 11. But I think most people are picking Michigan and Purdue in the preseason. You've got Illinois ranked highest. I guess I'm asking you to kind of step outside of the formula here and just from you watch a lot of Big Ten basketball. How do you view those 3, Illinois, Michigan, and Purdue going into the season? Like if you had to pick those teams and put them in an order, would you agree with what your formula spits out, or would you look at them a little bit different?
I would probably downgrade Illinois a little bit and have Michigan and Purdue as kind of the co-favorites. And that's the conventional wisdom. I think the knock on Illinois is that they lose an IO who was their best player, and just a great player and kind of a integral player for them at the end of games and things like that. So I think there's a tendency to say it's just hard to swallow that they would be as good or better than they were last year, right? So I agree with the conventional wisdom on that. The caveat being that, like, as I do these projections and I think so much about them, to me, the difference between projecting someone 5th or 15th in the country, there's just no difference, right? Like, it's
Right.
so far within the margin of error that I don't worry about that kind of discrepancy. Obviously it gets noticeable when you get up into the top 5, and that's fair. But, for instance, if 35th versus 45th, that can depend on how many minutes Miller Kopp gets,
Right.
So
For
it's
sure.
just kind of silly to spend, I don't spend that much time thinking about it. And, I just know how wrong these projections are going to be and how, and it's the computers, my projections will be wrong. And then people's projections will be laughably wrong as well. You're talking about like Lander last year. That's just kind of an example of how wrong the best thinking can be, right? The people who think about this the most, that know the most. So, and I can say that where the Illinois projection comes from, it's kind of similar to Trace, that Coburn coming back for his junior year is just sort of something that my system maybe can't really handle. The guy with his numbers, his size, his recruiting pedigree coming back for a junior year is not normal. And so he gets a monster projection. I think, like, I have sort of a pre-player of the year thing that's kind of for my eyes only, but he would be, I think he's number 1 in that projection. So it's kind of like, it's a little bit like there's a way that you can add Zion Williamson to teams in the sort of roster cast thing that I have. And, you see pretty much any team would become number 1 team in the country if you add sophomore year projection for Zion in there. And it's a little bit of that. It's just a monster projection. And, it's not totally implausible that he will be the best player, or at least the most productive player in college basketball next year if Crivello, blossoms a little bit more and gets his game a little bit under control. It's just, I think most Big Ten teams think of that as kind of a scary combination, right? And they've got parts surrounding him, shooters, Trent Frazier coming back for another year, Monte Williams, those guys. So it's a real, everybody thinks they're a good team, right? It's a matter of whether they're top 10 or top 20. So
one of the teams that I'm most interested in, just getting your thoughts on, and your formula and Ken Palm like them a lot. Maybe I'm missing something here. Ohio State, they're 8th in Ken Palm, I think 11 in your formula, but they have so many questions at guard. They lose CJ Walker, they lose Dwayne Washington. Their point guard is Jamari Wheeler, who we've seen play point guard in the Big Ten before. And, he's a great defensive player, but I've never been a huge fan of what he brings offensively. Is that more of a belief in kind of EJ Liddell and what Chris Holtman's been able to do over the last 3 or 4 years there, or is there something else beyond those two factors that forces, or that causes, I guess, you to like Ohio State?
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head there. It's EJ Liddell, who is another guy who gets a pretty monster projection, and I think it's a fair projection. I think most people are thinking he's a potential on the All-American,
right?
And it really, for me, looking at their roster, yes, they have a hole at point guard, but it's being filled by a solid Big Ten player. And what do they need at point guard? They don't need a star necessarily with the rest of their roster. And if I look down their roster, 1 through 9, those are all guys who I know. I've seen them play. I know their players. And then I think the 10th guy in my projection is a borderline 5-star recruit. So they've just got a lot of players. There's just no, other than I think for an eye test, there's a glaring hole at guard, but to the computer, it's like, the teams can handle this. And so that might be something where my system doesn't really assign any special value to a point guard, except that it requires teams to have one. So sometimes you'll see teams that have like a bunch of six guys and then some random 6'2" scrub being pushed into the top 3 of the minutes, because like I think coaches are gonna play a short guy a lot of minutes. So that's the only exception to that. And if that happens, it can downgrade a team. But the projection for Jamari Wheeler is a low usage, reasonably efficient guy on a good team. But then you've also there is the expectation, at least on my system on the defensive side, that the coach is going to maintain a solid defensive identity, and that the players who the system doesn't know much about, it gives them a boost because they're on this team. And I will say that looking back on last year's projections, there were similar comments made about Ohio State last year. And I think it was basically the same projection for them last year, and they lived up to it. So, that was one of those ones that got right last year along with Michigan. So we'll see if it does it again.
After watching Wisconsin last year, not being able to figure out how to play Potter and Reavers together successfully how do you look at Purdue? And it's obviously a different situation with Travion Williams and Zach Edey, who's just a massive human being that's hard to account for. Just game plan on a night. I think Purdue's got to figure out a way to keep him on the floor. But how do you kind of see that working out with those two guys? Can they play together at all, or how do you see that all shaken out?
Well, that kind of question is why Matt Painter gets paid a couple $1 million more a year than I do.
Yeah.
He from what I've seen, he said he's going to play them together, and that's obviously what Gard tried to do with Potter and Reavers. I think that it's a more intriguing combination than Potter and Reavers, obviously, especially in hindsight. But he's got to do it because from everything we've heard about Edey, he's just even gotten better. And I remember he had kind of his breakout game against Wisconsin last year. And I think I tweeted this, that like they should just run the play where they throw it to Edey and he turns around and scores while getting fouled every time. That's what he did over and over again. And it's just like, it was like, playing against second graders, kind of just like, couldn't get up to him, couldn't affect him at all. So he just seems like he's just a freakish specimen of a player, right? He's so huge and pretty coordinated looking, and he can move and run. Obviously, he's not going to defend on the perimeter, but he gets up and down the court all right. So that's one of the most intriguing things about this Big Ten year is just him in general, how he develops, and then how he can mesh with Williams, who's another guy who doesn't really spend any time outside the paint.
Bart, appreciate the time. I love what you do with the website. You're a fun follow on Twitter as well, and it's good that basketball is going to be back here in a couple of weeks. Hopefully, and I say this as somebody that follows the Big Ten as closely as anybody, but hopefully one of these years the Big Ten can win a national championship again in college basketball, because it's been 21 years now, and the longer this goes on, the more ammunition it gives to these other leagues to call the Big Ten basically a regular season fraud once the tournament rolls around. So it's let's work towards that hopefully in the next couple of years. And again, you can follow his website, barttorvik.com. Great resource for college basketball. Thanks for the time, Bart.
My pleasure. Anytime.
We'll be back again later this week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. We're going to have 2 episodes this week, but until then, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.